So in this keynote, what I want to invite you to do is to recenter on the causal association between poverty, social inequity, and mental health. Okay? I'm going to try and keep to time so we finish at 10:30. So I know it's supposed to be 45 minutes, but I'm going to try and cut it down a bit, but not lose what I'm hoping to say. So what I'm going to do, I want to invite you to step away from notions of competition between models. So this isn't about narrative therapy or relational and contextual therapy or systemic or cognitive. I just want to move right away from this. I want to name what I see as a shared concern. A shared concern about the relational and social context for experience, and the real effects these have on the people we work with and what we're actually going to do about that, really. You know, the ideas that might inform how we work with that. And I'm going to sort of outline why I see it as pretty urgent that we do this, that we think together about what ideas can we generate about how to address this. I want to make a politicised therapeutic response to the people I work with. That's what I want to do. So this means that the practices and the theories that we already have, our preferred ones, we might need to accommodate those, we might need to shift and change them a little bit to address what's going on. I think we need to find practices that make the connections between poverty and mental health visible, and not just inside the therapy room, but outside the therapy room, in a way that counts politically, so in a political space. So I'm going to kind of suggest a bit of a conceptual framework that gives us ideas about how to do that. And I'm also going to make some suggestions about how we might do it, okay? So every single meta-research project that's looking at the demographics and causes of mental health identifies a correlation between mental health issues and poverty. And it's not just any old correlation, okay? It's basically, it's poverty and social inequity are the major associative causal factors of mental health issues. If anyone wants to check this out, there is lots of meta-research, but the World Health Organization published a very good one in 2014. So they'd reviewed absolutely everything. This was quite useful because I was going to do that sort of for my own peace of mind. I wanted to go and have a look at that myself, and I had to take some time out. And when I came back, the World Health Organization had done it. I was like, brilliant, thank you. So this was on the front page, okay, so the report's a great big long one. It's a lovely blue colour, like a cobalt blue. But on the front page, this is what it says. Risk factors for many common mental health disorders are heavily associated with social inequalities, whereby the greater the inequality, the higher the inequality in risk. It is of major importance that action is taken to improve the conditions of everyday life. So it is the World Health Organization, so it's everywhere. And at the same time, that's lovely, that's a kind of national thing, but at the same time in my practice, this is getting worse. The socio-economic crisis is bringing it even more into centre stage. And I'm, talking about the basics here. So this is like access to education, access to food. I mean, that isn't okay, is it? Access to good housing. It's just not okay. And I no longer feel it is tenable for me as a therapist not to try and address these issues. Okay, I'm just not comfortable with that. And so I have to question, to what extent is this issue reflected or centred in our work, both inside and outside the therapy room? It's really easy to give this lip service. So we need to practice in ways that are mindful of diverse experience or issues of discrimination, but are we actually addressing it? Not just thinking about how we use our words, but are we even thinking about addressing it? There's this very strong causal association, very well evidenced. But poverty and social inequity, although they're connected in evidence, in practice, they've been disconnected really effectively and in a number of ways. There's been like a systemic disconnection of that causality. So firstly, there is a political disconnection between poverty and mental health, not very often talked about, other than in research. And then there are associated, what trickles down from that, there are service provision disconnections. So there is a structural separation of services into those that address mental health and those that address poverty and social issues. And then there's a reduction of the role of those services which addresses social issues, okay? You try referring to social care for poverty because somebody's struggling. It's nobody's remit anymore. The remit has been dispersed and located in non-centrally organised and voluntarily funded organisations. That was really, really evident, wasn't it, after Grenfell? It was so clear. People had nothing, and they didn't know where to go to get what they needed. Grenfell brought that to attention, but that's happening every single day for lots and lots of people. Okay. And the resulting mental health service, sort of separated off, its focus is on the alleviation of mental health symptoms, isn't it? And it's evaluated according to that. And then within mental health services, there's a real invitation to competition between models. Who best alleviate the symptoms? And that's really legitimised by the NICE guidelines. So even though all the evidence says, the models are not that significant, they really don't matter. And what matters as a cause is social inequity and poverty. And I would say that then affects actually the development of clinical models. So models have been developed which aren't considering social and relational issues in their development. And that's gone way back. So even if you think about early systemic theory, there was no consideration of social context and how you actually address that. From the present, the emergence of models of therapy from social constructionism and that kind of allegedly unlimited possibility of expanding and bettering lives through language and addressing discourse, that's absolutely amazing. But neither of them actually really considered the day-to-day effects of inequality. There is a potential to diminish and invisibilise the things that people are struggling with before they walk in the therapy room, and what they're going back to when they walk out. So I want to tell you a fairly typical family that I work with to give an example of this. So Sophie's the mum, and she's 25, and her parents are Jan and Pete, and she has a younger brother who's 13, and he lives with Jan and Pete. Now, I've actually known Sophie for some time. I wasn't directly involved in her care, but she was under a service I worked for years ago. But sadly, things didn't really work out for her. And she lost contact with her parents, Jan and Pete, until 2 years ago, and they were contacted by social care, saying, can you look after Sophie's 2 young children? They're Macy and Leah. And they did. And then a year later, Sophie had another baby called Ruby, who, again, the grandparents were asked, can you look after Ruby? And so the referral was then made to me, came to our service, because this arrangement was breaking down. Jan and Pete couldn't cope with the children's difficult behaviour. There was a feeling they needed a psychological intervention to help with that. So we could do a formulation of this, couldn't we, using psychological ideas. Sort of, we could think about attachment and about life story work and nurturing parenting. And I'm not saying that this might not be relevant or helpful. It might alleviate the distress felt in the family, their sense of agency. I absolutely agree with that. But the meta-evidence says that where there are socio-economic difficulties, that actually isn't enough, because they're just going to end up being re-referred or give up or say, this therapy isn't helpful. So I'm also keen at looking at contextual understanding of what this family are up against. Okay, so this is what they're up against. First off, the children have been placed there on special guardianship. Are people familiar with this arrangement? It's different to foster care. It was created to give children an increased sense of security with the people who care for them, without a formal severance from their birth parents, okay? But the carers, they lose an awful lot of support and financial benefits of being foster carers, okay? So they lose a lot. And this concept, it's great, it privileges that emotional, psychological security, doesn't it, of children, which is fantastic. But certainly where I work, it's been used rather a lot, possibly because it does save quite a lot of money for the local authority. And so what happens is that what children are losing, what families are losing, is a financial aspect of security. Looking after children who've had a difficult early life is really hard work, isn't it? It's enormously demanding, and it's much harder if you're struggling to feed and clothe those children. And I want to talk about housing here. This family, Jan and Pete, they were living in private rented accommodation in a 2-bed terraced house. It's like a 2 up, 2 down, we call them in Lancashire. 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs. And this was fine before, it was affordable, and it was suitable for an adult couple and their teenage son, okay? It is not fine with 3 extra children in it. It means there are 2 adults and 4 children in a 2-bedroom house. So you might go, well, why don't they just move? Well, they can't afford the rent for a bigger private rented house. There's a very long waiting list for social care housing. They both work really hard, actually, and Pete's just moved to working nights because it brings in a little bit more money, and also they're really trying hard to make sure one of them is always there for the children. So the consequences of this are everyone's really tired, and it's not great for their marriage, is it? If you're really tired, you never see each other. And it's not great for being available to children with lots of needs, if you're absolutely knackered. It's not great for their teenage son. He's got no space, he hasn't got any money, can't do the things with his friends he used to do. He's got less available parents, and he's struggling, and he's also being referred for therapy. So I agree with the referrer that the placement may break down, but I would see a significant aspect for this risk as lying in their financial and social situation. This is a really good example of how day-to-day issues, the issues of just getting by, are impacting on mental health, isn't it? Would an intervention around attachment sort this out? I think these parents, grandparents, would be getting on great, actually, if they weren't struggling so much. And would it even be fair to ask them to step into an intervention that requires them coming along every week? Unless those contextual issues are addressed, there's a potential to set them and us and me up for failure, because all those other causal factors are still present. And there's also the potential to actually worsen their financial situation in terms of the requirements, taking time off work, travel, etc., to come along to appointments. Okay, we're up against quite a lot in trying to address these issues. If you're interested as a therapist in trying to work with this, you've really got to be persistent. I'm going to share an aspect of what happened next when I started to try and address some of these issues, okay? So in terms of housing, a pretty simple action I could take is to write a letter of support, to social housing, try and see if we could get their priority changed a little bit. So I wrote a letter, and then I contacted other agencies and systems involved with this family to invite them to also write some letters of support. It's a paragraph, you know. And one of these was school, so I phoned SENCO, which in England is the Special Educational Needs Coordinator. Every school has one. So I phoned her and said, could you write a letter? And she said, I'm going to read this out. I can't write a letter of support for housing because I'm not qualified to comment on mental health. So I said, I'm not asking you to comment on mental health. I'm asking you to comment on the family's housing situation. And she said, well, I can't, because they haven't told me directly about their housing situation, so I don't know about that. So I said, well, ask them. And she said, I'll need to talk to my school safeguarding officer. Okay, so then I got an email. She said that writing a letter to support a social housing application was beyond their remit. They could make a referral to social care, but they weren't going to, as it wouldn't meet their criteria. So I phoned her back. And I said, can you talk me through this? And she said, basically, this isn't school's job. And I said, well, it's not my job, but that's the problem. It's not anybody's job. And actually, this is a major issue in the family's life. It's a paragraph. Why can't you do it? And she said, I know we could do it. This is great, this bit. I know we could do it. But all of the families who attend this school are living like this. So it wouldn't be fair to just write a letter for this family. And then I said, what the? I really thought it. I didn't. I actually didn't say anything. I just didn't know where to start. And I just said, you know what, that's absolutely fine. I did send her a copy of my letter. But what I was thinking is, okay, this is crazy. So there's a gross inequity and unfairness happening in society, and in that school's local context in particular. But to speak out for only one family would be unfair to the rest. So let's not speak out at all. That's what that conclusion is. So this conversation really reminds us that we need to ensure we're not only avoiding psychologizing poverty, but we're avoiding normalizing poverty. I have a real issue with that. I have an issue with lots of things. I have an issue with that phrase around at the moment, just managing, like it's a badge of honour. This normalises poverty, doesn't it? And it semantically steers, it sort of implies that people, the responsibility lies on people for being able to manage, not that the situations that most people are in are unmanageable. So this poor Senko, who, sorry, it's a brilliant but quite shocking example of everything I guess we've been talking about. It's rather unfair to single this conversation out because her response just reflects the outcome of that broad organisational, political and cultural disconnect between poverty and mental health. And we all live, as Todd May would say, in the milieu of discourse. We're all subject to that. The specialism of professionals, the separation of who does what, means that no one has their eye on this stuff. And if they do, it's like, well, I see it, but I'm not going to act on it. And that includes therapists, doesn't it? I've heard that loads. I know I've done it myself. I'm trying not to anymore, but I know in the past I'm like, for goodness sake, that's not my job. Okay. And that's really crazy, isn't it? When it's so prevalent that it actually feels unfair to address it for one family. That's how prevalent it is. Okay. So I think we should all make it our remit. That's what I'm saying. Okay, what can we do about this? Let's whiz through these. First off, we've got to make these ideas visible quite simply. And we've got to name it with other people so we can talk about it. I talked a little bit about how to do this in a workshop yesterday. I talked more about this. But I'm just going to summarise it here. First off, we've got to ask. It sounds very simple, but we have to ask people about the situations they're living in. If you're working in people's houses, you can kind of start a conversation about that quite simply. But some of my colleagues go, how am I going to ask people about whether they're skint or not? And I'm like, well, that's the skill of a conversation, isn't it? It's listening to people and then saying, blimey, how do you manage with that then? Isn't it? It's just being interested. And I kind of think it's like a respectful directness, okay? It allows us to deal with relevant political issues, but in my experience, families find that really acknowledging, that you're kind of asking about the context of their lives. And I think it can be quite a relief for a lot of families to be able to say, actually, this is a struggle. And unless they're asked about it, they don't feel they can say it in those mental health contexts. But there isn't another context in which they can say it. Does that make sense? It also means we can be really realistic about what's possible for families and people we speak to. What is actually reasonable to ask them to do? What can they change? And what do we need to go to other people and ask them to do? We can also ask about barriers to speaking out of turn. And, people are marginalised into groups. Really interesting hearing about that before. How do people's voices get heard? But there are also often some really obvious factors. People who perhaps find it difficult to articulate their concerns. And this seems so obvious when you're working with somebody who might struggle to speak. But people often talk over them, or they make up the gaps, okay? They just fill it in. And to come back to housing, how many people are disenfranchised because they haven't got a permanent address? So they don't get registered to vote, That's poverty. When we're having these conversations, it's really important we remember to ask locally. People don't inhabit big stories directly, they're mediated into local expressions. So we need to avoid that kind of position of universality, you know, well, everybody knows that somebody would be struggling in this situation. I don't know unless I've asked that person. What I might consider a bit of a struggle, the other person might not. What I might be considered a really good thing, the other person might not. And that's true about their hopes and dreams. You know, the things that I might not see as important, other people might. I don't want to trash people's dreams, particularly when they haven't got a lot. Okay. So in order to make sure I don't miss things of concern, to make sure I'm being super nosy about somebody's living circumstances, I assume a position of neuroanthropology. I've written about this. This is asking a lot of questions to check out the meaning of what people are saying in their lives. People asking as though I am an anthropologist, that I know nothing, so I've got to ask. This is really important if you live and work in the same area, because you can make some real assumptions. I can make some real assumptions about that. So basically, neuroanthropology is an active practice of being decentered. Okay, if decentered is a position, neuroanthropology is an active practice of that, being radically interested, including socioeconomic issues. The second thing I think we should do is we should make an effort to address the immediate effects of poverty where we can, to alleviate it. So we do what's doable ourselves. We write letters to housing. We try and encourage other people to. I was saying yesterday, we signpost people to community banks. Through some neuroanthropology, I was meeting with somebody and the story was she's not available for her children, she needs parenting issues, classes. She actually owed a lot of money and she owed the money to loan sharks and she was working 4 jobs to pay that back. And she became really tearful when she spoke about this, understandably. But one thing I could do that was really simple is I could put her in touch with a local community bank, and that reduces the amount of money she has to pay back. They pay off the loan sharks. And that means the whole stress on her is reduced, and there's more of an opportunity for her to step into thinking about, now that's sorted, what's left? How else might I think in relation to my children? Very important. And finally, we can create what Rancière calls political dissensus. Dissensus. D-I-S-S-E-N-S-U-S. As poverty and mental health have become separated as issues, we need to create an opportunity where they're reconnected, okay? We could do this by protest and marches. They give a sense of collective action to people, but historically they are largely ineffective politically, actually. And there are lots of ideas about why this is. I want you to just think back a few years with all those anti-austerity marches in the UK. And I want you to consider the political response made to those marches. These are all comments made by politicians, but actually by our Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron. So students, I think everybody in the UK was on a march at some point, yeah. Students were described by their protest as a feral mob hell-bent on violence. Young people were described as, there was a young person's march, sick elements in our society. Public service workers, a damp squib, irrelevant, and irresponsible. That's David Cameron's assessment of me. I was out on that November day. I was freezing my butt off. It was blooming cold in Blackburn. And I lost a day's pay. Doctors didn't. The doctors were paid to have a day off and not march. That's what the government decided. If we had a day off, and it was assumed that you were striking, so therefore you didn't get paid. So this was a way of trying to keep the doctors from being publicly visible. Does that make sense? We're more easily discreditable. These protests basically are discountable because they stand outside a political space. They're on the streets, aren't they? So they don't count. So what we need to do is to create a politically plausible space in which basically they can't be ignored. We need to make this a political inconvenience. So Rancière calls this dissensus, and I'll just give you a quick definition. It's made up of practices which introduce the expressions of people whose grievances are usually dismissed as noise into an arena which is normally only accessible to those who are entitled to speech. So basically, we need to mix this up a bit, people. We need to transgress it. And when this happens, it creates something that can't be accommodated within the usual political system, but it demands to be. So when we start, an example I gave yesterday, when we start refusing to psychologize issues that are actually due to poverty, so when we say, for example, I'm not going to sign that person off school because they're psychologically struggling, because they're not psychologically struggling, they can't go to school because actually they've only got one set of uniform and they've got to look after their little sister because their mum's going to a food bank, she goes once a Friday. I'm not going to sign that person off for the school. So the school then lose money and they have to pass it up. Okay, so this is, and eventually that's going to matter because school attendance is one of the things that's on the Global Investment Index, which is basically how good are countries to invest in. So when you start being a pain in the butt, you pass things up politically, and they may seem really small, insignificant things, but if everybody was to do that, it would start really counting in a way that politically mattered. Does that make sense? Yeah. These are some broad ideas about how you can do this. So notes are audited. They're actually legal documents. If you have to write notes about people, put in social poverty all the time, if that's relevant. I invite you to audit social inequity in your service rather than numbers of presentations of different mental health concerns. There are so many audits in services. Most of them, like I say, about presenting concerns. Every time we get a trainee in our service, people say, has anybody got any ideas for an audit they can do? And every time I say, what about social inequity? And it's taken me 2 years, but finally last week, that's what we're doing. I'm so excited about this, because it will actually mean my colleagues have to start asking those questions, because it's now an audit. Not they're not love me, my colleagues, they're absolutely gorgeous and I really respect them. But if you're not used to asking those questions, it's quite hard, isn't it? Record on anything you can. If you're writing a report, make sure you record any social injustice. Unmet needs, write them down and demand that other people write them down. It's amazing how many social care forms have lost unmet needs or have lost the bit that says actually this person is living in poverty. I mean, they've actually lost the place to write them. So if they're not written down, they never ever get counted, do they? So at the very least, we've got to make sure these things are written down. GPs are audited quite a lot. So I've always written letters to people and then copies to GPs. I'm starting to do it the other way around now. Or I'm starting to write a separate letter to GPs that really, really name where there's a concern. You have to persist. You really, really have to persist. Don't psychologise things. This is really hard. We were talking yesterday, and I work in public health, I don't work in private practice, but I was really reflecting last night how hard it is, what more of a dilemma in private practice, to be clear about when something is poverty and not mental health, because of course that's funded, isn't it? You know, you only get funded if you're doing something about mental health. So how do you do both? I understand that dilemma. Finally, my top trump, Z codes. Did everybody get a handout of these Z codes? They're absolutely bloody marvellous, these, and I want to thank the person who put me onto them, and I can't remember, she came up to me briefly and said, have you heard of these? And then she ran off again, and I don't even know who it is. And so I went and looked at them, and they're absolutely fantastic. Anybody who's working in mental health services can diagnose using DSM-IV and ICD-10, any of us. So my suggestion is, in this way of work, we might not be very interested in diagnosis. We say, oh, that's, you know, defining of people, we don't want to do that. Maybe it's a different thing if we're diagnosing social inequity and poverty. If we did this, these are counted, okay? If we were to put, because they're easily countable, because they have lovely little codes, don't they, and numbers. People love that. So if you were to put at the end of all your letters or reports, my diagnosis is Z, blah, 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 people don't even know that it's social inequity. You sneak them on, those audits. And, you know, I think if everybody here started to do that, that would be pretty extraordinary, wouldn't it? But also, tell people about them. People do not know about them. So I'm encouraging you, I guess, to some collective dissensu. Spread the word, start moaning about it, banging on about it, and please let me know. This, for me, is an ongoing process, and I want to collect as many practices as possible for dissensu. Thank you so much for welcoming me.